Hello, this is Ben Television News Roundup, a compilation of major stories in the weekending. I am Tuli Alabi. Thank you for being part of the program today. British Labour Party has said businesses in Britain are considering their position following the inability of the government to provide clear direction as to its Brexit policies. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn made this known during the Prime Minister's question time. The report.
When the Prime Minister wrote at the weekend that she wanted as little friction as possible, was she talking about EU trade or the next cabinet meeting?
Can I say to... I think the right honourable gentleman knows full well that this government has a policy of leaving the customs union, and of ensuring that as we do so, we have as frictionless trade as possible with the EU, that we have a solution which ensures we have no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and also that we have an independent trade policy. But if he's talking about friction, perhaps he could reflect on the fact that this month the Shadow Health Minister in the Lords voted for a second referendum, that at the weekend the Shadow Brexit Secretary refused to rule out a second referendum, and on Monday the Shadow International Development Minister tweeted in favour of a second referendum. So perhaps when he stands up he could put the minds of the British people in this House at rest and rule out a second referendum.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, the divisions in the Cabinet mean there's been no progress in negotiations for 5 months. The reality is the Cabinet is more interested in negotiating with each other than it is with the European Union. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's promise of as little friction as possible is in stark contrast with the earlier commitment that it would be friction-free. So could the Prime Minister explain how much friction she is willing to accept? Businesses and workers in those companies need to know.
I say to the right honourable gentleman that we want to ensure that we are able to continue to trade in as frictionless a way as possible. And the suggestion that trade at the moment is entirely frictionless is actually not correct. But we have set 3 very simple objectives for a future customs union. Now, I will say to this House that achieving those objectives, which I've just set out, is not easy. It is difficult. There will be some who will say, actually, forget about an independent trade policy. That is not the position of this government. There may be some who say, don't worry about the Northern Irish border. That is not the position of this government. It is absolutely right that we are aiming to achieve those 3 objectives. And when he talks about progress, we'll be publishing a white paper in a few weeks which will show how much progress we are making on these issues.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they're no nearer to agreeing a white paper than they are on the strategy for going forward. I would remind the Prime Minister that the UK is the slowest of all major economies and slower than the Eurozone in growth as a whole. The uncertainty and recklessness of government is putting jobs and investment at risk. Last week, Airbus confirmed their space contract will move abroad post-Brexit. And the company has gone on to say it's considering its overall position in the UK because of the government's complete lack of clarity. How many other businesses have warned the Prime Minister that they too are considering their future in this country?
The right honourable gentleman talks about preparations in the negotiations and the white paper. Let's just remember what his position was. His position was that we should have triggered Article 50 immediately after the referendum. With no work having been done in preparation for the negotiations, he wouldn't even have had a white page, let alone a white paper to base his negotiations on. And what would that have led to? What Labour do every time in government? They'd have sold Britain out.
Jeremy Corbyn! The problem is, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's own position isn't even supported by her cabinet. Rolls-Royce have said, Mr. Speaker, Rolls-Royce, we're worried about border checks. We need to be thoughtful and careful about future investments. Ford, any sort of border restrictions and customs friction is going to be an inhibitor to us continuing. Vauxhall, we cannot continue to invest in a world of uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, businesses are understandably frustrated by this government. This week, the Environment Secretary gave his view on the Prime Minister's preferred customs partnership model. He said there have to be significant question marks over the deliverability of it on time, as it has flaws. Well, at least he didn't call it crazy like the Foreign Secretary. But, Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister cannot even convince her own cabinet of her strategy, what chance does she have of convincing 27 other European countries?
I'm going to say to the right honourable gentleman that he has taken this view of our position in negotiations before. Before December, he said we wouldn't get a joint report, and we did. Before March, he said we wouldn't get an implementation period, and we did. And we continue to negotiate. But if he's asking about what British businesses are doing, I'll tell him what British businesses are doing. They're creating more jobs in this country. So we now have record levels of employment in this country. What did we see under Labour? 500,000 more people unemployed, because Labour governments always leave office with more people out of work than when they went in.
Jeremy Corbyn! Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on record numbers of zero-hours contracts, record numbers of people in in-work poverty, and a record of wages lower today than they were 10 years ago.
EU leaders have expressed concern at the dangers posed by returning EU nationals who have gone abroad to fight. The leaders who met in Rome discussed ways to mitigate the risks posed by the foreign returning fighters.
Officials taking part in the conference said cooperation between OSCE members is essential in order to prevent violent extremism and effectively tackle the challenge of foreign fighters returning to Europe. The venue where the meeting was held was this centrally located Rome hotel. Security was tight during the two-day gathering. 360 participants from 47 different nations took part in the conference to discuss the reverse flow of foreign terrorist fighters. The conference was held here in Rome because Italy currently holds the rotating presidency of the OSCE. Emphasis was placed on the need to increase the sharing of information between OSCE states because foreign fighters returning from conflict zones are a transnational threat. Among those present, Italy's top anti-terror judge, Federico Cafiero de Rao.
The evolution of the terrorist threat has opened new scenarios that impose adequate strategies. The military defeat of the Islamic State has had consequences documented in our country through a number of investigations and information.
Investigators, including De Rao, had just announced a successful anti-terrorism operation carried out in northern Italy, which uncovered 2 alleged jihadist cells and led to a number of arrests.
14 people were arrested in the operation, including 11 Syrians and 3 Moroccans. The charge for 4 of them is association aimed at terrorism activities, and the others, conspiracy to finance terrorism in addition to crimes for abusive financial intermediation aimed at money laundering.
Investigators were able to track the laundering of about $2.4 million, some of which was sent to the Al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front. OSCE members in Rome expressed fears that foreign fighters returning to Europe would undoubtedly set their sights on forming so-called sleeper cells. They may recruit and fundraise for terror groups, incite terrorism, and stage terror attacks.
U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to quit the Iran nuclear deal has set the U.S. on a collision course with some of its closest allies in Europe. President Trump said that America will apply the maximum sanctions against Iran and any company that does business with the country.
Just hours after being sworn in, new U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to NATO headquarters in Brussels, where he highlighted how much the United States values the transatlantic relationship as a pillar of world security and stability. But that relationship has taken a hit recently, with the U.S. saying it will sanction any firms that do business with Iran. German Chancellor Angela Merkel spoke in Berlin Tuesday on U.S. President Donald Trump's decision last week to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal.
We've now seen a shift in German-American and European-American relations. While Great Britain, France, and Germany were of the opinion that the agreement against Iran's nuclear armament is an agreement that certainly has weaknesses, it is an agreement we should stand by.
Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif met with his European counterparts in Brussels Tuesday to discuss how to keep the Iran nuclear deal alive.
But it's up to the European Union and European Union member states to make sure that their interests and our interests are protected and that illegality by the United States is not rewarded.
Secretary Pompeo says the nuclear deal created wealth in Iran that drove its malign activity, and that the U.S. withdrawal was not aimed at Europe. But experts say Europeans are furious at the U.S. for reimposing sanctions and feel their options are limited.
So Europeans felt that they are left with absolutely no choice, but that also this administration has no strategy, no plan B. So basically, Americans are decided for Europeans and for the rest of the world that they want to pull out of this deal and re-establishing sanctions, not only for their companies, but also extraterritorial sanctions, and therefore deciding on the fate of the Iran deal for everybody.
Asked by VOA if he thinks there will be a diplomatic standoff over sanctions on Iran, Trump's national security advisor John Bolton said no.
I think inevitably as U.S. sanctions kick in, it'll have an effect on Europe. I think their trade and investment with Iran will drop as well. And I think Iran then faces a very difficult choice.
Bolton added the economic benefits of the Iran deal will soon dry up, and that Iran's economy is already facing difficulties, which led to demonstrations at the end of last year. Tuesday, the State Department announced Pompeo will give his first major foreign policy speech next Monday. The focus, Iran.
A team of health experts has arrived at the Democratic Republic of Congo after an outbreak of Ebola virus was confirmed in the Central African nation. A vaccine has since been developed against Ebola after its last outbreak in some West African countries 4 years ago.
The first batch of experimental Ebola vaccines arrived in the Democratic Republic of Congo on May 16th. But there are few similarities between the current Ebola outbreak in Congo and the outbreak that ravaged West Africa for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016. One major difference is that there is now an experimental vaccine. While the vaccine was developed during the West African outbreak, it has proven to be safe and effective.
Merck, the vaccine manufacturer, has reassured WHO that we have access to further doses of vaccine as necessary during the outbreak.
The Health Ministry plans to start vaccinating those exposed to the virus in the next few days. Isolation units to treat the sick are already in place, and even though the outbreak is in a remote rural area, no one involved is taking anything for granted.
We are very concerned, and we are planning for all scenarios, including the worst-case scenario.
The head of the World Health Organization has visited the country, and the government of Congo has agreed to cooperate.
I thought it was very commendable and a great sign of the change of outlook that Dr. Tedros himself was personally there, and that was very important. It rallies the troops, it shows determination and commitment and speed.
The WHO has reorganized since the devastating outbreak in West Africa that killed more than 11,000 people. A lot of lessons were learned from that epidemic.
The response to this outbreak has been quite different from the very delayed response over a 6-month period in 2014 in the outbreak in West Africa. It's the 9th outbreak in Congo. This is a country that has a lot of experience in dealing with outbreaks of Ebola.
While the fear is that the outbreak could travel to major cities, as it did in West Africa, systems are already in place to make sure that if at all possible, it doesn't.
A UN-backed study on refugees from the World Bank's International Financial Corporation has suggested that the refugee camp in Kenya has become a hub for business opportunities. The refugees in the camp run and manage growing small businesses that are adding values to their lives and the Kenya economy.
Refugees run over 2,000 small businesses in the Kakuma camp in northwest Kenya, supplying everything from Wi-Fi to canned food. Many pay some taxes, despite receiving no services from the country, and most incomes in the camp depend on aid.
I came with nothing, so I started my business here in the refugee camp from scratch. I started looking for employment, working for people, and here I am.
The World Bank Group's International Financial Corporation says Kakuma is a vibrant, informal economy and is urging private investors to take advantage of the opportunities.
Yes, the private sector is there to make some money. The private sector in return brings job opportunities for host population and refugees, better delivery of services, more sustainable one in our opinion. That's the IFC experience so far over 60 years, but also brings local economic growth to an area.
The 26-year-old refugee camp and the neighboring town of Kakuma boast a combined $56 million economy, with a total population equal to Kenya's 10th largest city. Benjamin Akale-Kwam owns the Kakuma Peana bookstore.
About 70% of our business is from the refugee camp, especially the NGOs around here.
The camp's population more than doubled in the past 5 years. The refugees hail from 18 countries, with the new arrivals primarily from South Sudan.
There has been some questions that have been posed, whether the refugees are simply dependent on the humanitarian aid. The IFC report clearly showed that the economy is well beyond what the humanitarian agencies provide here.
Somali refugee Hassan Mohammed Adan was luckier than most. He was able to borrow money from relatives to start a business. But restrictions prevent refugees from legally owning or renting property, moving freely, and expanding or partnering with a Kenyan.
So we need that documentation. We need also support, because you need money, okay?
While Kenya's restrictions on refugees are unlikely to change, the UNHCR is moving from handouts of food and vouchers to cash allowances, something the IFC says should help attract private investors.
With that report, we conclude the news roundup for this week. Thank you for being part of the program. I'm Tunde Alabi. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye. Regardless resident status abroad, living outside the shores of one's homeland can really be challenging and sometimes very difficult. Let's be sincere, to keep pace with updates from the host country abroad can really be difficult. Here on Dialogue in Diaspora, we give you every information, every news, every current issue you need to know on updates outside the UK. Dialogue in Diaspora is your link between the world and the United Kingdom. It's your window to Africa development. Here, live on Ben Television.